Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this morning to kick off the week with some CPD. My name is Fionnuala Callery, and I'm the chair of the Southeast Region. This morning, our webinar is titled What is Impact Biomechanics? This webinar will outline how forensic impact biomechanics uses tolerance data, crash testing, modelling, and medical evidence to investigate accidents and safety issues across industries. Impact biomechanics applies principles of mechanics, engineering, and biology to understand how the human body responds to forces and accelerations. The presentation this morning provides a brief history of the field and shows how forensic impact biomechanics uses human tolerance data, crash testing, computer modelling, and medical evidence to investigate accidents and safety issues across different industries. Our speaker this morning is Ana Barbir, Director of Life Sciences at Rimkus. Ana holds a BEng in Biomedical Mechanical Engineering, a Master of Science in Biomedical Engineering, and PhD in Mechanical Engineering. Please put any questions that you might have in the Q&A box at the bottom, and Ana can take questions at the end. I'll hand you over to Ana now.
Thank you, Fionnuala. Hello, my name is Ana Barbir, and I'm a biomechanist. As was just explained, my degrees are in biomedical and mechanical engineering. My PhD is technically in mechanical engineering, but it was from a spine biomechanics laboratory where I quantified material properties of intervertebral discs in compression and torsion. So this presentation that I will give you a taste of what biomechanics is and specifically how it's used in forensics engineering. So I work for Rimkus, which is a global engineering company that does technical consulting and forensic investigations in a number of different areas. So they have offices all over the world, and they have over 900 different scientists and engineers. So just a little bit of a overview of what I'm going to be covering today. So we're going to start with biomechanics in general and its history, impact biomechanics in particular, and then uses of impact biomechanics in forensic investigations, and then a little bit of a summary and conclusion. So to start off with biomechanics, what is biomechanics? So it comes from ancient Greek, so bios meaning life and mechanica meaning mechanics. And it's basically the application of mechanical principles to living organisms. So mostly in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about how it applies to humans, but historically and currently, there's been research looking at how it applies to animals. I've worked at an equine biomechanics laboratory where we looked at forces applied to joints of horses. There's also dinosaur biomechanics looking at paleontology. There's plant biomechanics, which looks at how different forces grow plants to grow differently in their environments. And then getting to organs and tissues and cells, there's biomechanics that looks at forces. For example, lung biomechanics looks at lung compliance, different tissues. As far as cells, there's even kind of a little twist on biomechanics that's called mechanobiology, which basically looks at how forces change gene expression within cells. So it's a fairly broad field, but I'm gonna focus more on what I do, which is impact biomechanics. So just a brief history of biomechanics. So it first started in ancient Greece. There was so Aristotle actually wrote a book on motion of animals. So looking at early descriptions of muscle activation and also geometries that produce movement. Then moving on to the Common Era, Galen was a physician who did early anatomy studies of animals and got some things wrong and some things right. And then Al-Nafis was very influential in looking at the cardiovascular system and the pulmonary system and basically getting some things right that Galen got wrong. And then moving into the Renaissance, Da Vinci and Borelli introduced force analysis. So they looked at muscle activation and joint mechanics. Borelli was able to figure out the location of the center of gravity for a body and how to calculate it. And then moving to the 1800s, early animal and human motion studies started being captured with photography as advances in technology were made. And so the Muybridge was an early scientist who looked at motion, especially horse motion, but also human. And then Wolff's law, also in the 1800s. So Wolff was a physician and a surgeon who looked at bone, and he found that what's now referred in biomechanics as use it or lose it law, which is basically that with application of force, the trabecular bone tends to grow, and with loss of force, so for example in space, the strength of bone decreases. So just to get into the different types of biomechanics, so typically it's organized into, there are different ways to do this, but one of the ways is by application. So you can divide it into sports biomechanics, clinical biomechanics, occupational biomechanics or ergonomics, and then forensic biomechanics, which is what I currently do. So sports biomechanics is typically what you see if you follow sports. So it optimizes sports performance, focuses on injury prevention, can also be, if you just look at YouTube videos of how to best do push-ups or whatnot, a lot of that is based on research in biomechanics. Clinical biomechanics looks at movement dysfunction. So after some kind of accident where a person has their muscles have been out of use, clinical biomechanics can look at how to rehabilitate that. And then occupational biomechanics and ergonomics looks at interactions between workers and their environments. So, for example, working on a line in a factory, but also things like our everyday interaction between computers and humans, and also mobile phones, tablets, and so on, and also looking at how to improve safety. Forensic biomechanics is largely automotive, but it also looks at things like slips, trips, and falls, falling objects, and basically any ways where we can figure out how human interaction with their environment, where there were forces or accelerations involved, caused some kind of injury. Okay, so then moving into impact biomechanics. So if mechanics is the study of how objects behave when forces are applied to them, then biomechanics would be the study of how living things behave when forces are applied to them. And impact biomechanics specifically would be a study of how living things behave when forces that have high rates of onset and durations that are considerably less than 1 second are applied to them. So it's basically biomechanics at really short time intervals. So the common applications of impact biomechanics are protections of vehicular occupants, prevention of sports-related injuries, analysis of injuries due to falls or falling objects. So impact biomechanics is basically a part of all the major applications of biomechanics, but it's looking specifically at the events that happen at short time intervals. So a little bit about impact biomechanics, and so that, as you may imagine, came about mostly through once cars were being used, and we started seeing injuries due to that. So in the 1930s, a surgeon noticed that it was actually the collision between the passenger and the inside of the vehicle that caused the injuries. So the first countermeasures were applied that, and the first idea, I guess, was that the injuries were happening due to the contact with the dashboard or the windscreen, And the first countermeasures that were applied were engineers started thinking of ways to make sure that the human body moves with similar deceleration or acceleration as the rest of the vehicle. So first seat belts, and then also additional padding on the dashboard were first countermeasures that were looked at. And then in 1938, I believe, was the first barrier crash test at General Motors. So they actually crashed a car, and that kind of started a whole motion of safety in automotive research, looking at how to minimize injuries. In the 1940s, an engineer and a brain surgeon came together to look at diffuse brain injuries and concussion based on data they got from motorcycle crashes during World War II. And then in the late 1940s, there were human tolerance studies. This was mostly in the U.S. through the military, where they had volunteers. So this was mostly Colonel Stapp, who was doing these high-speed deceleration tests out in the desert in Utah, looking at kind of the limits of human endurance during decelerations. And then crash test dummies were developed starting in the 1950s, originally for the aerospace industry, but then eventually for automotive, looking at basically measuring the forces on the human body. So they were an anthropomorphic test device that included accelerometers and force gauges to be able to measure the expected accelerations and forces at different parts of the body. So including accelerations at the head, at the spine, and different parts of the body. And then that around the same time, first computer simulations came into place as well, so that we didn't have to crash a car every time we wanted to learn something new. And those are still being used today. So the basic objectives of impact biomechanics are to understand how a body region is injured in an impact. As I said, historically this has been mostly through car impacts, but it can also be applied in different ways. And then also to minimize injury through any environmental modification. So this plays a role in design of automotive restraint systems, design of vehicle interiors, and also understanding of how injury is caused. And again, this could be injury in a automotive sense, but also different, but also any other sense in which a human can be injured. So this is where forensic impact biomechanics comes in, is basically understanding how the injury is caused. So how the forces have an impact on what is happening inside the human body. So the connection between impact biomechanics and general engineering is that it basically applies similar principles. So just like a forensic fire investigator will look for causes of a fire, or a forensic civil engineer will look for causes of a failure of a bridge, or a mechanical engineer will look at causes of failure of a machine. Similarly, a biomechanical engineer will look at failure of bone in the same way. So looking at stresses, strains, and so on. So in order to do a forensic impact biomechanics analysis, the first thing to look at is the mechanism of injury. So how did this injury occur? Was it due to the most obvious is direct contact? So if there is a direct contact of the person with the interior of the vehicle, that's a possible mechanism of injury. There's also the potential of indirect forces. So this is when a body part is forced in a certain direction where due to acceleration. So for example, during car crashes, the head will move ahead of the rest of the body because of the linkages happening at the neck. Another possible mechanism of injury is when a body part is forced to exceed its natural range of motion. And then we also have the acceleration, deceleration type forces, which is what happens when also during head movement, as the brain can move with respect to the skull. So there can be perhaps sudden deceleration of the head, and then an acceleration deceleration of the brain with respect to the bony structure. So we would look at loads sustained by tissue and compare this to known tissue tolerances to loads. So through most of 20th century, there has been a lot of testing of human tolerance. So for example, we know that the femur fractures at forces greater than 11,000 newtons. But then as we're looking at this through a forensic lens, we also pay attention to any pre-existing conditions that could potentially cause the bone of that particular person to be able to be fractured at lower forces. I guess one thing to note here is that unlike human-made materials, the range of forces at which human bones fracture is much larger because of differences in mineral bone density, differences, just genetic differences between different people, differences in use of bone, and so on. So in biomechanics compared to mechanics, which of materials, there's a much larger range of at which fracture, for example, or happens. So in order to look at the forces applied to the human body in a vehicle collision, the first thing needs to be to assess the dynamics of the vehicle first, so that then we can figure out how the body of the human was moving with respect to the vehicle. So the important parameters to look at here would be the location of force, so which body part is it applied to, the direction of force, where is it coming from, the magnitude of force, and then the duration of the impact force. And the dynamics of a vehicle upon impact are most commonly quantified in terms of the change in speed, which is called delta V. So that's kind of the most important parameter for linking what happens to the vehicle to what happens to the human body, both because it's mostly because that's what's been used for a lot of the testing. So then we can easily compare what happens in a particular case to the literature about what's happened in a wider set of cases. So delta V is a change in velocity. So it's the change in speed of a vehicle from immediately before the impact to immediately after the impact. So obviously delta V over delta T is acceleration, and it's the impact that takes place over the time period delta T. And what causes the potentially injurious conditions to occur is how short that delta T is. So in car crashes, this is approximately 1/10 to 3/10 of a second. It's longer when we have side swipes. But it is this really brief amount of time in which the change of velocity happens that's potentially injurious, because if you're just accelerating your vehicle from 0 to 60, you don't expect to be injured, right? So it's that very short change in time. And it's generally proportional to the extent of vehicle damage and the likelihood of occupant injury. And this is why it's a commonly used measure. Okay, so then the kind of the basic collision orientations that we see in car collisions, the most common is the rear end to front. So in this case, we look at both the vehicle that's being impacted, which is undergoing a rear impact, and the car that's undergoing a frontal impact. There is lateral impacts. These could also be there could be variations to this. So in this case, it's what's called a T-bone collision, where the vehicle impacts exactly at 90 degrees and exactly to the center of gravity of the vehicle. But obviously there can be slightly different collisions where it impacts at a different angle, and also in a different location in the car when you can then you can start to have some yawing of the vehicle. And then also shallow angle or side swipes. So this is in this case not as much of the momentum is transferred, and there's basically just friction between the side panels of the vehicles. So how do we quantify the accident? So one of the ways we do this is through comparative damage analysis, or crush analysis. So we look at the amount of crush. We can do some calculations. We can also look through historical databases to compare the amount of crush to the vehicle that we see to what has historically been measured, where the actual delta V was measured for that particular vehicle. We can also do a vehicle dynamic reconstruction, looking how the vehicle was moving prior to the accident. We can do this with simulations. There are different simulation tools like PC Crash or HVE. And then the most recent one is event data recorders. So in the US, this has been available for close to 20 years now, that it's been required by FMVSS regulations for vehicles to record both pre-crash data and data during the event. So basically delta V. And then more recently, the EU has required that all new vehicles also record this information. So if it is available, it's something that we can get directly from the car. So this is basically like a black box type event data recorder. Okay, so how do occupants, then once we can determine what happened to the vehicle, then the next question is, how do the occupants move in response to a collision? And this basically just goes back to Newton's first law. And in case of this photo here, in a motorcycle, obviously there really wouldn't be anything stopping the rider, and the contact would be with the ground eventually. Inside a vehicle is slightly different because you're enclosed on all sides by the vehicle interior, and in a car, occupants would generally move towards the point of impact. So if it's a frontal collision, the occupant will move frontwards. If it's a rear collision, they would move rearwards, and so on. With obviously with respect to the vehicle. And this gets a little more complicated once the vehicles once we have some rotation added. So how do we where do we get all this data about occupant mechanics? So some of the data sources are volunteer studies. So at low speed accidents, so usually up to about 8 miles an hour, we have volunteer data. We have ATDs, or crash test dummies. So there are tests that have been done on them where we can pull out information from their accelerometers and force gauges. There's also historically been post-mortem human surrogates that we've done testing on to get information. A lot of these were actually what was used to build the to validate and to build the ATDs. And then there are also databases of real world crashes. So we can look at the amount of crush, and then also the types of injuries that people in those crashes were subjected to. The other data that we have is what are called barrier tests. These are usually required by regulations in different locations. So there are tests where vehicles are crashed into a solid barrier. Sometimes it's into a movable, or sorry, into a crushed barrier. There is also cases where a movable barrier is crashed into the side of the car. And then there are sled tests. So this is where a vehicle seat is basically attached to a sled, and the whole thing is decelerated at the same acceleration that was recorded during barrier tests. So this is so that we don't need to crash a car every time, but can look at what happens to the occupant as a result of these accelerations. And then more rarely, but there are different places to do full vehicle tests where we can basically repeat what happens in a real world car crash. Okay, so now I'm going to go a little bit into forensic impact biomechanics and kind of how knowing all this information about what happens to vehicles then helps us figure out what kind of injuries to expect of the occupants. So as I explained earlier, kind of the four major types of crashes are frontal, rear, lateral, and side swipes. So I'm going to just go through each one of those. So, and obviously for each one of these, there will be differences depending on whether what the speed is of the impact, right? So a lot of the tests are done at lower speeds just because that's what's easiest to do, and also for volunteer tests it's what's possible. And even with ATDs, crash test dummies, there's a limit how far you can take it. So for forward frontal impact kinematics, you would expect an initial forward motion, which would be limited through the engagement of the seatbelt if it's worn. Then there would be a rebound motion to the original seated position. And so this is from a paper that did some testing. So this was done at a delta V of 11.8 miles an hour. And you can see these little trajectories. So there's a trajectory of the center of the head, which is in red. There's a trajectory of the shoulder, which is in green, of the elbow, which is in blue, and then of the knee, which is in yellow. And so with this paper found is that the forward excursion was the greatest for the head, as you would expect, and it was the smallest for the knees. And you can kind of see how far the head would go. It would go forward and down. Basically, when wearing a seatbelt, so this is for seat-belted cases, and when wearing a seatbelt, the motion is restricted mostly by the hip, by the lap belt portion of the belt, and then the shoulder belt is also restrains it, but there's basically a hinging motion going on at the hip, and the crash test dummy or the occupant moves mostly by hinging at the hip. And then as that motion happens, the spinal segments are predominantly in tension. So it's mostly forward flexion of the body, and the spinal segments are in tension. So this is some testing that was done at Rimkus about 15 years ago, I think. But I will show. So this is the vehicle, and then this is the occupant of that vehicle. So I will show like each video separately. So this is the vehicle just moving forward, and it crashes into a side of another vehicle. And then this is the same. This is it's a high-speed video of the occupant. So this was, if I remember right, I think this was at 8 miles an hour delta V, and you can see that he doesn't actually make contact with the airbag, and that's because there was a slight rearward motion of the seat back in the beginning. And then you can also see that he's not holding the steering wheel, and this is because it was just for testing purposes. But studies have been done at looking at holding of the steering wheel, and basically it's speeds greater than 3 or 4 miles an hour, you can no longer hold on. So basically, you let go of the seatbelt of the steering wheel anyway. Okay, so then this is just to show kind of what the seatbelt and the airbag contributes to the motion of the safety of the occupants. So this is from an Australian NCAP test, which was done at 25 miles an hour. So the occupants closest to us are both not wearing seatbelts. So the front one is going to make contact with the airbag, the rear one is not. And then the occupants further away from this picture are both wearing seatbelts. So it's showing what happens when there's a seatbelt plus an airbag, and the rear one is showing what happens when there's a seatbelt but no airbag. And this is at 25 miles an hour. So I'm just going to play so you can see. So this is, you can see that the front occupant just slides and then basically kind of hinges around its knees. And then you can see the difference when they're wearing their seatbelts. There's much, much less motion. So the seatbelt and the airbag were optimized to work together to create the conditions under which the head of the occupant would contact the airbag. Sometimes we're asked to look at seatbelt use evidence, and so this can be done both by looking at mechanical evidence and injury evidence. So, for example, if there was a frontal impact and the seatbelt was being worn, there's usually evidence on the seatbelt itself. So there's some melting of the fibers of the webbing, and there's also some and due to the friction between the seatbelt and the D-ring, there's also some melting of the plastic on the D-ring. So that would be mechanical evidence. There are also what are called pretensioners in modern vehicles. So as the vehicle senses, as the sensor finds out there's going to be a crash, and the airbag is instructed to fire. Also, pretensioners are instructed to fire, and they basically tighten the seatbelts just as the collision is about to happen. And as that happens, if it's a buckle pretensioner, it will tighten. So the top one is the buckle before it's fired, and then the bottom one is the one after it's fired. So one of the things you can see when you go look at the vehicle after an accident is you can see that if the pretensioner has fired or not. The other thing that we could look at would be injury evidence. So there could be evidence of broken ribs, but also evidence on the skin and soft tissue damage to the abdomen. So during front injury crashes, there is at low speeds, there is low potential for any contact with the interior of the vehicle if the seatbelt is worn. So 50% of airbags deploy by 9 miles an hour. So at speeds after that, there's also some potential for rotator cuff injuries if an arm is placed over the airbag and then forced backwards. Regulatory tests in most locations are done only up to 35 miles an hour. So if properly belted and if occupant is in a proper position and the airbag deploys, the head contact would be directly with the airbag and no injuries would be expected. As we start to get into higher speeds, obviously there's potential for the airbag bottoming out. So there's potential of contact with the steering wheel. There's also potential of contact with the windscreen. As you start to get into very severe crashes, there's potential for footwell intrusion into the occupant space and injuries to the feet and lower limbs. As I mentioned, rotator cuff injuries are possible with airbags. So if a muscle, so rotator cuffs are made up of 4 different muscles. And the injury is usually to the tendons, not specifically to the muscles, and it's typically to the tendons of the supraspinatus muscle. Um, but most rotator cuff tears are actually degenerative. So there's this, in a lot of the injuries that we run into, there's a question of whether this was degenerative or whether it was due to this one-time impact event. So most rotator cuff tears are degenerative, but they can happen due to traumatic injury, especially in high energy events such as car crashes when an arm is forced out of its normal position. So as I mentioned, there's this question of traumatic versus degenerative injuries. So traumatic are ones associated with a one-time impact event, whereas degenerative injuries are happen due to accumulated tissue change over a long period of time. And many injury diagnoses could have both. So for example, rotator cuff tears could have both. But part of what we do is to be able to tell the differences between degenerative type injuries and traumatic type injuries. So for example, if you're looking at muscle fibers or tendon fibers, whether it's a clean cut or whether it's fraying fibers, and so on. Okay, so this moves us into rear end collisions, which actually when I worked in the US was the majority of what I saw, although since I've been in the UK, it's much more varied. So in rear end impacts, it's basically the opposite. So initial movement is rearward. The seat back usually rotates rearward under occupant loading at speeds greater than 5 miles an hour usually. And then there's potential for some hyperextension of the neck, so movement backwards. But this is typically prevented by a head restraint if it's worn, if it's adjusted correctly. And then there is subsequent forward rebound motion, but this is normally limited through the engagement of the seatbelt if it's worn. And then the largest motions would be at the neck, cervical spine, and again, spinal segments are predominantly in tension. So you're moving them, you're moving the head away from the torso. So this is a 10 mile an hour sled test that's done. I think this one was done in the US, but so this is basically a recreated crash pulse with an occupant just in a seat and wearing a seatbelt. So you can see this motion of the seat back as well as the motion of the head restraint, and then you can see the rebound. Okay, so this is a stage rear end collision that I was in 11 years ago. So this is the vehicle that will be impacted, and this is me inside the vehicle. So I'm going to play this one first. And then this is with a high-speed camera capturing what's happening in here. And again, this was at, I believe, 5 miles an hour delta V. So yeah, so just kind of to see the motion. Okay, so then potential for injuries in rear end impact. So neck strains, when delta V's are greater than 5 miles an hour, there's a potential for that. There's a small potential for low back strains, especially with heavier individuals and at higher delta V's, once the back begins ramping up the seat. And of course, as delta V's go much higher than 5 miles an hour, there's definite potential of this. There's a paper that looked at human volunteers and said that human volunteers could be exposed to delta V's of 11 miles an hour without reasonable expectation of injury. Again, this doesn't really account for neck strains and potential lumbar strains. And then there's a paper that that looks at risk of concussion at low speeds, and it's basically negligible at low speeds because there isn't really a potential for the head to hit anything. Again, this is if the person is in position. Once you start getting into out of position cases, there's a variety of things that could happen. So one of the common injuries that we look at is injuries to the intervertebral disc. So the intervertebral disc is a spongy material between your vertebra. It's made up of what's called a nucleus pulposus, which is kind of a jelly-like material in the center, and it's held in place by what's called an annulus fibrosus, which is layers of fibers holding it in place. And altogether, it acts like a viscoelastic material, and basically, which means that it acts differently depending on the speed at which the forces are applied to it. So a common thing that happens is disc herniation, and so this is illustrating different possibilities of what can happen with discs. So you can have a herniated disc where the nucleus is pushing on the annulus fibrosus, and you can have a ruptured disc where it's actually pushed through the fibers and out. The disc herniations have been shown to mostly occur due to degeneration and aging. There have been cases where it was able to be reproduced in studies of one-time events, such as car crashes, but where it was able to be reproduced is due to hyperflexion coupled with compression. So all different modes of injuries were looked at to be able to reproduce this herniated and ruptured discs, but the only way that they're reproduced in a biomechanical setting is if there is a large hyperflexion, so flexion beyond the normal range of motion, coupled with a compression. So they don't normally happen in extension or any of the other modes. So another thing in low speed accidents that's often seen is strains and sprains. So the difference being that a strain is to a muscle or a tendon, and a sprain is to a ligament. And again, both of these can happen due to chronic overuse conditions and due to one-time impact events. And as I said, at speeds less than or greater than 5 miles an hour, there's always potential for these in the neck and eventually in the lower back as well. Okay, next I'm going to look at the lateral movement. So in the lateral collisions, you basically have the crash side occupant and the far side occupant. So the person who is on the side where the crash is happening and the person on the other side. Obviously, the person on the crash side, depending on the speed of this, has high potential for direct injuries, direct impacts, and the person on the far side is less so. So this is from some testing that was done at speeds up to 9 miles an hour. So the initial motion again is towards the impact, and then the return motion is usually towards and beyond the original seated position. There is at speeds up to 9 miles an hour, there is no significant contact with the two occupants, but there is head contact with the vehicle side window, even at these low speeds of 9 miles an hour, that can happen. So at the injury potential in this case, at low speeds, there's a potential for neck strains, for crash side occupants, and then there's a potential for low back strains for far side occupants. The crash side occupant, there's a potential for head injury, shoulder injury, and rib injury, basically all the body parts that are in contact with the side of the vehicle. And then for unbelted occupants, obviously there's potential for occupant interaction and chaotic movement, and yeah, much harder to model than frontal or rear impacts because of this potential for interaction. Okay, and then the last one we're going to look at is side swipes. So this is kind of a shallow angle without much transfer of momentum, basically just side panels of the vehicle sliding against each other. So these are some really old tests that Rimkus has done. In this case, there is some snagging, so that's when a structural part of the vehicle actually gets caught. So there's some spikes in acceleration that happen during that bit. So I will play this really quickly. And then this is the occupant inside. This is a high-speed camera, and it's slower. And you can see that the motion is fairly small during side swipes. And they basically just kind of rock back and forth on the suspension of the vehicle. So yeah, so there's minimal change in position with respect to the roadway. The delta V is close to zero. There's some vibrational disturbance and shaking on suspension. There is extended acceleration. So instead of this happening on the order of a tenth or 3/10 of a second, it happens over a few seconds. And the acceleration is usually below 2g unless there is snagging. And so snagging happens, then there can be these spikes of acceleration, which are short, so maybe 50 milliseconds. But in the absence of snagging, the vehicle dynamics are usually similar to basically what happens during driving, maybe driving over potholes and so on. One last thing is about helmet testing. So this is for looking at types of injuries that happen outside of cars. So this isn't specifically looking at bicycle helmets, but I've also done testing on motorcycle helmets. But here you want to look at what happens with just destabilization. So if the person just falls off the bike versus if there's a projection of the occupant over the handlebars or over the bonnet or roof of a vehicle. Here, obviously, once you start to get into that, there's a potential for head injuries. There's a potential for skull fractures at impact and also brain injuries. So helmet testing by regulation there's two tests. There is when the helmet falls onto a flat surface, and that's done at heights of 1.5 meters. And then there's also hitting at a rounded anvil, which is supposed to model a curb edge, and that's at 1 meter. And obviously both of those are relatively low heights. So the helmets are basically tested for destabilization, for falling over, right? Because 1.5 meters on a bicycle is about the height of the rider. It doesn't take into account if there's a projection of the rider. And so there've been some tests done into probability of injury ranging with drop height. And what this shows is that up to 2 meters, there is some protection. But once you start getting above 2.5 and 3 meters, the helmet no longer provides any protection. And then this is a little bit related to concussions, which are another kind of injury that we often see. So in low speed accidents, obviously there would be little potential for this. There would be some contact with the headrest, but it would be fairly low. But then with things where the head is directly exposed, like in motorcycle or bicycle accidents, there is obviously potential for high head accelerations. And it's possible to have high head accelerations even without skull fractures. So this is just a bunch of different studies that have looked at both angular acceleration of the head and linear, and related this to chance of injury. And that is it. So this is just quick takeaways. So biomechanics has a long background, and And impact biomechanics in particular deals with events which last less than a second. Forensic impact biomechanics looks at link between injury and the dynamics of an event. And vehicle occupants generally move towards the point of impact with some subsequent rebound motion. And injuries depend on the location, direction, magnitude, and duration of the impact force. I think I went a little longer than I promised. I'm sorry.
Great, thanks, Anna. That was really, really interesting. It's brilliant to see how the engineering decisions and considerations are taken into account there, and the similarities in the force and all of that.